And I'm very happy to share my views, but I should at the outset say very clearly that these are my own views and not the views of WTO members or the WTO Secretariat necessarily. And in my presentation, I'm going to go back to basics, if you will, and I would like to spend some time reminding us why we need international trade, spend some time reminding us why the world needs the WTO, and then in my concluding remarks, I will also try to touch on current events a little bit to the extent possible. So let me start right away with the first part, why the world needs international trade. And I think here what I'm going to say links quite well or builds quite well on what Mike already talked about. Because if you ask me why we have a globalization crisis, my answer would be that it's not so much because people have forgotten about the economic gains from trade, but instead it's because people are increasingly of the opinion that trade is part of the problem when it comes to addressing some of the key challenges we face today as a world. And the challenges that I have in mind are first to maintain peace and security, and I include in this also economic security. Second, to reduce poverty and inequality, and third, to achieve a sustainable economy. And this new narrative, in my assessment, didn't come out of nowhere, but was what was the consequence or gained traction amid a series of crises and tectonic shifts in the global economic balance. So first, we had the rise of geopolitical tensions, which of course raised concerns about the weaponization of trade policy. We had the COVID pandemic that highlighted the importance of resilient supply chains. We had the rise of China that led to disruptions in labor markets in some industrialized countries. And we also have the climate crisis, which raises concerns whether international trade is even compatible with decarbonization of the economy. So what I want to, and of course, I mean, perhaps worth reminding, this is of course a fundamental departure from the trade affirming narrative that has guided trade policy making since basically the end of the Second World War, the foundation of the GATT, and is a little bit, I would say, mirroring what Mike said in his presentation, that trade is less driven by a comparative advantage and more driven by all these other considerations. The point I want to make is that this is a misconception, that trade is actually not the problem, but it is part of the solution, not just in the sense that it brings economic gains from trade, but also in the sense that it is an important part of the solution to these broader challenges. And I think it's very important to make this case, because if we just run around and say, well, globalization has all these great economic benefits, I think to some extent, I mean, it's an important point to make, of course, but I think we're missing or we're not responding to some of the criticism that is arising. So let me walk you through the logic that I have in mind a little bit. And let me start with the first challenge, to maintain peace and security. And I'll mainly talk about economic security. I might say a little bit about national security at the very end, but very briefly. And let me just, I have something here in the way, so I don't see my own slides. I'll just try to move this a little bit. So that's better. So the first thing that you, oh, that's not better. Oops. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure this out here. Yeah, that's better. So the first thing that I wanted to say is it is pretty clear that international trade is an important part of the solution when it comes to guaranteeing when it comes to providing economic security. And the COVID crisis, I think, is a great example. What you see on the left-hand side, you see an illustration of how resilient trade was during the pandemic. So at the beginning, of course, there was supply chain disruptions. I think we all saw and perhaps were affected by them. But it was also remarkable how quickly trade recovered. Basically, within 3/4 of the first wave of lockdowns, trade was back to its pre-pandemic trend. And not only was trade resilient, trade was also an important force of resilience. And that's what you see on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, you see the trade in medical goods rose very quickly during the pandemic, making sure people had the medicine or the medical goods they needed, including towards the end, of course, vaccines. But it wasn't just medical goods. If you remember working from home, for example, where did all the home office equipment come from? Where did the office chairs come from? The computers come from? The cameras come from? It was, of course, all international trade. And if you think about it, it also stands to reason if we live in a world that is more risky, that is more and more characterized by shocks, of course, what you want is you want to diversify. You don't want to rely on just one country, but you also don't want to rely just on yourself. And this is really where multilateral trade, I think, has an insurance function also to play. In the interest of time, let me maybe not talk about national security, but we can talk about this in the Q&A if anyone is interested. So the second point, reducing poverty and inequality. So I would be the first to admit that trade liberalization or trade, that the growth of international trade has led to disruptions in some labor markets in some industrialized countries, even though I think the effect is not as dramatic as it is sometimes portrayed. But what you can see on the left-hand side is just a correlation, admittedly, but I think it's a telling one, is that if you just look at a cross-section of countries, income inequality is actually only weakly correlated with trade openness. So there's plenty of economies that are very open to trade and very equal, and plenty of economies that are not open to trade and also very equal. So it seems like the primary determinants of within-country inequality is not international trade. And what you see on the right-hand side is really what I think is the main story, if you will, which is that trade integration has literally lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So here what you see is that since 1995, which was the foundation of the WTO, the poverty rate in low and middle income economies fell from 40% to 11% as their trade participation doubled from 16% to 32%. And we've done some analysis here at the WTO in our latest World Trade Report, where we come to the conclusion that up to 1/3 of the convergence that we observed between low and middle income economies on the one hand and high income economies on the other hand was due to trade cost reductions, which were in part due to negotiations here at the WTO. And now the third point, achieving a sustainable economy. So here, when people think about trade, they typically think about transport. When they think about transport, they think about transport emissions, dirty trucks, dirty trains, dirty planes, and immediately come to the conclusion that trade must be bad for the environment. And I'm, of course, the first to say, yes, we need to decarbonize transportation. But what you also have to see is that transport emissions are only a small share of overall emissions, and there's a large variation in production emissions across countries. So that if you import something from a greener origin, the saving that you can achieve in terms of production emissions can more than compensate the additional transport emissions that you incur. Now, this is, of course, a bit of a partial equilibrium idea. So we've, if you will, extended it to general equilibrium and developed this notion of environmental comparative advantage. So we all know that there's economic gains from trade, and the economic gains from trade come from countries specializing in what they're relatively good at. And by exactly the same logic, there's also environmental gains from trade, and they come from countries specializing in what they're relatively green at. Now, the key difference between the two is that the economic gains from trade arise naturally as the outcome of market forces, but the environmental gains from trade need some help in the form of supportive climate policies that help firms and households internalize the externalities of their consumption and production choices. So one thing we do here, just to illustrate the power of trade as a force for good when it comes to climate change, we have a quantitative model of the world economy. And just as a thought experiment, we say, well, what would happen if there was a worldwide carbon price? And what happens is, well, greenhouse gas emissions fall. That's not so interesting. But we have a decomposition which shows that around 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions reducing effect of the carbon tax is due to these environmental gains from trade. So it's not trying to say that trade is always good for the environment, or it's not saying that trade the way it is now is necessarily good for the environment, but it's saying that it's a strong force multiplier for climate policies. So that in a nutshell then is my argument for why trade is important, why it's important to embrace trade, not just for economic gains, but also to build a more secure, a more inclusive, and a more sustainable world. And here, just to conclude this part, we've already heard it to some extent in the previous presentation, and in some sense, I think it's also important to get perspective that perhaps it's not too late yet. So if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, what you see, what you're supposed to see, it's maybe a bit difficult to see, is that globalization has slowed. We saw that in the chart that Mike has shown us, but it's we don't see any deglobalization. So at least up until now, trade and GDP grow roughly proportionately, although of course it remains to be seen what the rising trade policy uncertainty is going to do to that now. What we see, and we also heard this from Mike, is we see some fragmentation along geopolitical lines. So that's why we need international trade. So let me briefly say why I think we also need the WTO. The first thing I want to say is that despite all the criticisms, and some of them, of course, also justified ones, the WTO remains one of the most significant achievements of the international community, and it also continues to shape global trade. And my favorite statistic here that we just calculated is that more than 80% of global trade still takes place under the WTO negotiated most favored nation tariffs. And that's despite the proliferation of free trade agreements. That's despite the tariffs that are in place between the United States and China. That's despite anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, and so on. So the 80% or more than 80% doesn't take into account yet the latest tariffs that were imposed on China. But bilateral trade between China and the United States is only 3% of world trade, world merchandise trade. So that's not going to change this number so much. So in that sense, perhaps a broader way to explain it is when people assess the WTO, in a way they always just look at the flow, what new agreements is the WTO delivering? And they don't so much look at the stock, what is really that the WTO has already achieved. And the first point I want to make is that the stock is significant. The second point I want to make is that even the flow is non-negligible, even though I wouldn't claim, of course, that there's another Uruguay round in the making here. But along all the three main functions of the WTO, negotiation, implementation, dispute settlement, things are happening. If you look at the negotiations front, we have progress both in multilateral negotiations as well as in plurilateral negotiations. And especially on the multilateral front, it's really quite remarkable that 166 members can still come together in consensus, because it's a consensus-based institution, and agree on something, for example, like our recent agreement on fisheries subsidies. But there's also plurilateral initiatives, which means these are coalitions of the willing, if you will, on services domestic regulation, on investment facilitation, and also on e-commerce. If you look at implementation, maybe not so exciting, but also really important in the day-to-day work, we have a committee that deals with technical barriers to trade, for example. And what happens is that governments or members are notifying each other of new regulations that are coming in, that they're thinking of introducing. And then there's a discussion whether these new measures might be perhaps overly trade restrictive or not. And like this, simply because you have this forum for dialogue, a lot of potential trade tensions don't even take place. And then lastly, on dispute settlement, yes, it's true that the appellate body doesn't work. And of course, yes, this is a problem that our members often highlight, but it's a two-tier system. The first tier still works. That's very important. And second, there's also a plurilateral workaround, the so-called multi-party interim arbitration arrangement, which, for example, China and the EU are a member of. So not to say that everything is perfect, but just to point out that things are actually happening. And I think a very important point today is to realize that the WTO is about much more than tariffs. So in particular, we also have the general agreement on trade and services. And we also heard this in Mike's presentation, that services trade is particularly dynamic, especially trade in digitally delivered services. I mean, if you think about it, 30% of work in the US is done from home. If you do it from home, you can also do it from abroad. So there's huge potential for growth in digitally delivered services. And we just came out with the numbers for Q3 of 2024, which is the latest time we have. And we saw a year-on-year growth of 10%. And by the way, the United States is the world's largest services trade exporter, having a market share of around 13%. Next, the TRIPS agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights. Of course, strong intellectual property rights are essential for innovation and growth. And again, the WTO is the caretaker of this agreement that basically guarantees minimum property rights in all 166 members. There's various ways of measuring the importance. One interesting number that I came across is that cross-border payments for the use of intellectual property through licensing arrangements and things like that now exceed $500 billion. And again, the US is the world's largest IP exporter with a market share of 28%. And then besides, we have all sorts of technical agreements that would also really be a huge pain to negotiate bilaterally. Anything from sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade, but even things like customs valuation. You know, what's even the value of a good on which you want to impose a tariff? Then the last thing I want to say is that, of course, I often say the WTO is a little bit like a central bank, and that it's, in a central bank, it's also not just about inflation, but also about inflation expectations. And of course, for us, it's the same thing. It's not just about trade costs, but also trade cost expectations. So the credibility of the system is really key. It's not just important that nothing, tariffs, for example, are not increasing, but it's also important that members trust that things are going to stay stable. Now, despite the fact that the WTO continues to be the cornerstone of global commerce, of course, many of our members point to the need for reform. And here I've highlighted a few points that often come up in discussions. So many members argue that we need to revitalize the negotiations function, for example, by strengthening plurilateral approaches. I think there's relatively widespread agreements that we need to update the rules, for example, to capture developments in the digital economy, to capture climate concerns, to deal with industrial subsidies, but also to deal with new geopolitical realities. So, for example, to what extent can you use a security exemption? Then on reform, on dispute settlement, the obvious point is that the appellate body en passé needs to be resolved. So with that, let me conclude and try as much as I can to say something about the current situation. Of course, these are challenging times for global trade. And our Director General has repeatedly said is that what we need now is a calm, a pragmatic approach in which open dialogue is key. The priority is to prevent an escalation of trade tensions, but also to contain the spread of trade policy uncertainty. And I think that's a very important point that I already made before, that the credibility of the system is also key. And in all the simulations that we have been undertaking, trade policy uncertainty really is playing an important role. And there's a large literature, or an important literature, let's say, in economics that is also documenting the trade cost increasing effects of trade policy uncertainty. The last thing I want to say is that numbers also help keep things in perspective. And I think I mentioned that number already. But if you think about US-China trade tensions, for example, which understandably are very visible in the news, it's important to keep in mind that US-China trade accounts for less than 3% of world merchandise trade. So the rest of the world is quite big. Let me stop here. Thank you.